For years, Washington told the world that if companies wanted certainty, scale, and access, they had to go through the United States. Donald Trump just blew that model up. Today, two global automakers, Nissan and Volkswagen, are sending a quiet but unmistakable message. When Trump turns trade into a weapon, Canada starts to look like the safer bet. This is not about cars. This is about how Trump's tariffs are reshaping North America, and how Canada is turning U.S. volatility into a strategic advantage.
Over the past few months, Nissan and Volkswagen have publicly signaled that they could expand their offerings in Canada, not by copying U.S. models, but by bringing in vehicles certified for Europe, Japan, and South Korea. Why does that matter? Because for decades, Canada aligned its vehicle safety standards almost perfectly with the United States. That alignment made the U.S. the regulatory gatekeeper for the entire North American auto market. Now, that gate is cracking. Canadian regulators are reviewing whether to decouple from U.S.-centric standards, opening the door to global vehicle platforms that never passed through Washington's approval process. And crucially, both Nissan and Volkswagen are backing that move. Their message is clear. Canada is no longer just a downstream extension of the U.S. auto market. It is becoming its own regulatory and commercial destination. This shift is happening against a very specific political backdrop. Donald Trump is in his second term as U.S. president. His administration has revived aggressive tariff threats, including 25% duties on imported vehicles and auto parts, while repeatedly signaling that trade policy will be used as leverage, not stability. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney is responding with a different strategy: diversification, predictability, and reduced dependence on U.S. political mood swings. And global automakers are watching closely.
Let's be blunt. Automakers do not choose sides out of ideology. They choose risk profiles. Under Trump, the United States has become a high-volatility environment for global manufacturers. Tariffs can appear overnight. Exemptions can disappear just as fast. Trade policy is announced at rallies, on social media, or through last-minute executive threats. For companies that plan product cycles 5 to 10 years out, that is poison. This is where Canada quietly wins. Canada is offering something the U.S. currently cannot: regulatory calm. By signaling openness to European and Asian vehicle standards, Ottawa is telling automakers you don't need to redesign your entire lineup just to survive Washington's politics. Nissan's comments are especially revealing. The company has openly acknowledged that Canada has demand for smaller, more affordable vehicles that the U.S. market does not prioritize. In the past, those models were blocked because they didn't fit U.S. certification logic. Trump didn't create that imbalance, but his tariffs made it impossible to ignore. Volkswagen's position reinforces the same logic. The company sells far more models globally than it is allowed to sell in Canada today. If Canada loosens its dependence on U.S. rules, Volkswagen gains immediate flexibility without expanding its exposure to American trade chaos. This is the key point many U.S. commentators miss. Trump's tariffs are not bringing jobs home. They are changing corporate math. When the cost of relying on the U.S. rises, companies don't always fight back. They reroute.
The United States still has scale. What it is losing under Trump is credibility. Canada, by contrast, is leaning into its reputation as a rules-based, predictable economy, even while standing firm against U.S. pressure. Ottawa has already shown it is willing to enforce trade agreements strictly, including against American firms that fall outside compliance frameworks. At the same time, Canada is accelerating trade and regulatory diversification across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. For automakers, this matters more than speeches. A vehicle approved under EU or Japanese standards can be sold across multiple global markets with minimal modification. A vehicle trapped inside U.S. certification logic cannot. By opening its system, Canada is effectively saying you don't have to choose between North America and the rest of the world anymore. That puts U.S. automakers in an uncomfortable position. A more open Canadian market disadvantages U.S.-only platforms, while rewarding companies with global supply chains. And that disadvantage is not caused by Canada. It is triggered by Trump's insistence on turning trade into a loyalty test. Ironically, this is exactly what Trump claims to oppose, America losing influence over global rules. Yet, here we are.
We've seen this movie before. Trump imposed tariffs on China and supply chains shifted to Southeast Asia. Trump threatened allies and trade blocs diversified. Now Trump escalates auto tariffs and Canada becomes the alternative hub. This is the pattern. Pressure without predictability produces exit, not obedience. Nissan and Volkswagen are not staging a protest, they are executing risk management. And that should worry Washington far more than any headline about foreign cars. Because once companies redesign their strategies around Canada, they don't simply snap back when the political mood changes. Regulatory independence is sticky. Market diversification compounds. What makes this shift more significant is timing. This is happening as the White House signals that tariffs are no longer a temporary tool, but a permanent feature of U.S. policy. For automakers, that distinction matters. Predictable costs can be managed, political volatility cannot. When trade rules change by headline, companies don't adjust pricing, they adjust geography. Canada is sending the opposite signal. Ottawa is modernizing regulations through consultation, not threats, and aligning with globally accepted standards rather than improvising policy. That tells boardrooms Canada is planning, not reacting. Once automakers build pathways that reduce dependence on U.S. volatility, they rarely reverse course. That quietly erodes Washington's leverage inside North America. Trump's strategy may raise pressure, but Canada's stability is what actually pulls investment. There's also a consumer consequence Washington is missing. If Canada opens its market to European and Asian models, Canadians gain more affordable choices, while U.S. buyers remain stuck with tariff-inflated prices. That gap reshapes demand over time. Trump's trade strategy raises costs at home, Canada's stability expands options. In the auto industry, that difference quietly determines where the future flows.
Donald Trump believes tariffs force loyalty. Canada understands that stability earns it. Nissan and Volkswagen didn't wake up one morning and choose Canada. They responded to a system where U.S. policy has become unpredictable and Canadian policy has not. The result is a quiet but consequential shift. North America no longer revolves automatically around Washington. So here's the real question going forward. If Trump keeps exporting uncertainty, how many more industries will discover that Canada is the safer place to plan the future? Because once that realization sets in, it's not America first anymore. It's America optional.
It is the only moment of Mark Carney's day that the UAE is allowing Canadian media to film as it restricts access. Behind closed doors before that, Carney met with the UAE's president and signed a new investment agreement.
It's part of his ongoing mission to reduce Canada's economic reliance on the United States.
Canada just made one of its boldest economic moves in years, and it happened far from Washington's shadow. Prime Minister Mark Carney has signed a major investment agreement with the President of the United Arab Emirates, opening the door to a new era of trade, capital flows, and strategic partnerships. And make no mistake, this is not just diplomacy. It is Canada declaring to the world that it will no longer allow Donald Trump's trade war to define its future. Carney arrived in Abu Dhabi this week with a clear purpose: to secure new partners as Canada accelerates its plan to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade. The visit included a tightly controlled tour of the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque, the only moment UAE officials allowed cameras to capture. Behind closed doors, however, real business was happening. Carney met privately with UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Together, they signed a new bilateral investment agreement, a treaty designed to protect and encourage foreign direct investment between the two countries. At the same time, both sides formally launched talks toward a Canada-UAE free trade agreement, something that no Canadian government had seriously pursued with the Gulf states until now. Carney's office says the pact will open doors for Canadian aerospace firms, engineering companies, agri-food exporters, and seafood producers. In return, the UAE signaled interest in investing in Canadian ports, mines, liquefied natural gas, critical minerals, and infrastructure, sectors Canada sees as essential for its long-term security and global competitiveness. The backdrop is undeniable. Donald Trump's second-term tariff campaign has driven Canadian exporters into a corner, with 10 to 100% U.S. border taxes hitting autos, steel, aluminum, and even food products. Reuters recently reported that Canada's exports to the U.S. have already dropped nearly 10 percentage points since 2024, the steepest decline in decades. Carney's response has been consistent: diversify or be dominated. As former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, now part of Carney's business delegation, told reporters, there's a bigger world out there than just the United States. And according to him, none of these agreements happen unless the Prime Minister personally leads the charge.
For nearly 40 years, Canada has lived with a fundamental economic vulnerability. More than 75% of its exports flowed into a single market, the United States. When relations were stable, that dependency created comfort. But under Trump's renewed protectionism, it has turned into a strategic liability. The new UAE agreement is part of a broader Carney doctrine: build a global trade network that prevents any future American administration from holding Canada's economy hostage. Over the past 6 months, Carney has aggressively pushed deals across Asia, the Indo-Pacific, and now the Middle East. He met leaders in South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia. He initiated a major ASEAN trade push. And last month, he announced internal reforms to eliminate interprovincial trade barriers by mid-2026, a structural fix long demanded by Canadian businesses to compete with U.S. scale advantages. Each move chips away at the old assumption that Canada must live at the mercy of American moods.
The UAE is not just another trading partner. It is one of the world's largest sovereign wealth investors, a country with deep capital surpluses and a hunger for stable democratic markets. For them, Canada is a perfect match: resource-rich, politically stable, and increasingly aligned with global clean energy demand. A bilateral investment treaty gives UAE investors the certainty they need to commit billions. For Canada, this money could accelerate LNG export terminals, northern deepwater ports, critical mineral extraction, and Arctic infrastructure, all areas where U.S. politics have slowed progress. According to reports in regional Gulf media, UAE officials have already signaled interest in large-scale investment in Canadian energy corridors and technology hubs. And unlike the U.S., the UAE is not demanding tariff concessions or political favors in return.
The timing is not accidental. Trump's second-term tariffs have created bottlenecks in North American supply chains, discouraged U.S. investment in Canada, and pushed firms like Stellantis and GM to relocate production south of the border. This has sparked backlash in Ottawa, where Carney's government now openly admits that dependence on the U.S. is no longer sustainable. Internationally, analysts are noting a trend. Canada is being pulled into a more multipolar trade world, where the U.S. is no longer the automatic center of gravity. The UAE deal reinforces that shift. It signals that Canada can attract partners even while the U.S. turns inward. It gives Canada new bargaining power in any future USMCA renegotiation. And it warns Washington that the era of unquestioned Canadian alignment may be ending. Trump's administration, meanwhile, has struggled to respond. While U.S. officials accuse allies of disloyal trade behavior, the reality is that Canada is reacting to U.S. aggression, not initiating it. Trump's tariffs created this diversification wave. Now he must live with the consequences.
There are, of course, risks. The UAE faces international scrutiny over allegations involving Sudan's conflict, though the UAE strongly denies involvement.
Carney raised regional security concerns during the meeting, but his office did not disclose specifics. Still, the geopolitical complexity does not erase the strategic logic. Canada must expand its economic alliances at a moment when the U.S. is unpredictable, China is slowing economically, and Europe is overextended. The Middle East, especially the Gulf, offers something rare: capital, demand, and a willingness to engage without ideological baggage. Canada's investment pact with the UAE is more than a trade story. It is a statement of intent. It tells the world that Canada is stepping into a new era of strategic confidence, willing to build alliances on its own terms, and determined to escape the gravitational pull of American politics. The question now is simple: will this be the beginning of a global Canadian commercial renaissance, or the first step into a more competitive, multipolar future where every partnership carries new risks? Viewers, what's your take? Is Canada finally standing tall on the global stage?
That approval rating for the president, it is at a low point of his second term.
The president appears to be getting into the kind of territory that's generally very dangerous for a president looking forward to the midterm elections.
Trump's defeat didn't arrive in one sudden moment. Instead, it unfolded across three fronts: on the global stage, inside the halls of Congress, and finally at the United States Supreme Court. It began at the APEC summit in South Korea, where Prime Minister Mark Carney made it clear that Canada would not quietly accept Washington's tariff aggression. It continued when members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, openly challenged Trump's escalating trade war. And it culminated when Supreme Court justices questioned whether Trump ever had the legal authority to impose those sweeping emergency tariffs in the first place. Taken together, these events form a rare alignment, a moment when Trump's political strength weakens just as Canada steps into a period of renewed confidence and ambition. In other words, Trump's triple defeat opens a window that Canada has not seen in years. The sequence began in late October at the APEC summit in Gyeongju, South Korea. While President Trump arrived with pressure tactics and tariff threats, Carney arrived with poise, intention, and a strategic message. Canada will diversify, Canada will build, and Canada will no longer rely on a single partner for its prosperity. His meetings with President Xi Jinping of China and leaders across Asia signaled a serious shift. Carney spoke about hinge moments in history, moments where nations either rise to shape their future or fall behind, waiting for others to decide it for them. He then unveiled a plan rooted in confidence and urgency, a $1 trillion investment blueprint to rebuild Canadian infrastructure, expand clean energy, accelerate housing construction, and push Canada into the ranks of global middle power leadership. Soon after APEC, attention turned back to Washington, where Trump faced something he rarely experiences: bipartisan resistance. Senators from both parties warned that Trump's tariff campaign was raising prices for American families, damaging cross-border supply chains, and hurting U.S. farmers who depend on access to the Canadian market. For the first time in Trump's second term, lawmakers publicly questioned whether his tariff-first approach was sustainable or even economically defensible.
It's a congressional power, not a presidential power, to tax. And you want to say tariffs are not taxes, but that's exactly what they are. They're generating money from American citizens, revenue.
This political shift didn't eliminate Trump's policies overnight, but it weakened the foundation that allowed him to pressure allies. When Congress begins to distance itself from the White House, the leverage that once made Washington intimidating becomes far less reliable. And then came the most dramatic development of all. On November 5, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments on whether President Trump could legally impose tariffs using the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Almost immediately, justices on both ideological sides pressed the Trump administration's lawyer on the limits of presidential power. Justice Sotomayor emphasized that taxing authority belongs to Congress, not the president. Chief Justice Roberts questioned why the statute did not actually mention tariffs.
Justice Gorsuch warned that once Congress hands power to the president without limits, it becomes a one-way ratchet that Congress can never reverse. Those comments exposed a deep skepticism that cuts across the ideological divide and signaled that Trump's emergency tariff authority, the very tool he used against Canada, may soon be invalidated. If the court rules against Trump, his signature trade weapon disappears, and for Canada, the balance of power shifts. If Trump loses the Supreme Court case, his most powerful economic instrument becomes unusable. Not only would ongoing tariffs face legal scrutiny, but any future attempt to target Canada with sudden unilateral tariff hikes would require congressional approval, which is far less likely given the political opposition already forming. For Canada, this legal constraint provides breathing room. It reduces uncertainty around cross-border trade, reassures investors, and strengthens Canada's position in negotiations. A presidency accustomed to acting alone would suddenly confront institutional limits. Congress pushing back against Trump is not just a political story, it's a structural shift. When lawmakers argue that tariffs hurt Americans more than they help, the political incentive to maintain a tariff war collapses. And when both parties arrive at that conclusion at the same time, any attempt by the White House to escalate becomes riskier. This moment gives Canada something it hasn't had in years, a divided Washington. A divided Washington is less capable of shaping Canadian industries, less aggressive in imposing economic punishment, and far more constrained in its ability to dictate the terms of North American trade. Canada now has the space to pursue its own strategy, and Carney is using that space with precision. The timing could not be more important. As Washington's institutions question Trump's authority, Carney is presenting Canada's boldest economic plan in a generation. The budget he rolled out, infused with infrastructure expansion, clean energy investment, advanced manufacturing, and aggressive housing construction, is designed not merely to offset the 1.8% GDP hit caused by U.S. tariffs, but to push Canada into a new phase of growth. Carney's message was simple. We choose Canada. We choose to invest in Canada because this is our country. This is your future. He wasn't just announcing a budget, he was declaring a philosophy, one rooted in national self-reliance and a belief that Canada's economic destiny cannot be tied to the decisions of a single neighbor. The combined effect of APEC, congressional backlash, and the Supreme Court's skepticism marks a rare geopolitical moment. Canada is asserting itself independently while the United States faces internal constraints. Carney's outreach to Asia, reinforced by new partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and China, is reshaping Canada's long-term orientation. For decades, Canada's economy was built on a simple assumption. Stability in Washington meant stability in Ottawa. But the world of 2025 is different. Supply chains are shifting, alliances are evolving, and unpredictability in U.S. politics has forced Canada to pivot. Trump's weakening position only accelerates that pivot. The window for Canada is not just about avoiding harm, it's about claiming opportunity. The global economy is being rewired, and for the first time in years, Canada is moving decisively rather than reactively.
A tariff on Canada is a tax on Americans.
Now, while we can't control what the U.S. does, we can decide what happens here. This is Canada, and we can build the future we want for ourselves.
Trump's triple defeat came not from a single opponent, but from the convergence of institutions, the courts, Congress, and international partners, all pushing back at once. And as the United States hesitates, Canada rises. Carney has outlined a long-term vision. International partners are responding, and domestic investment is finally being framed as a tool of national strength rather than political caution. But windows don't stay open forever. The question now is whether Canada will seize this moment to redefine its role on the world stage, or step back and allow Washington's internal storms to shape Canada's future once again. The choice, as Carney said, belongs to Canadians.
You have Canada. It's so great to have, in fact, the president called and he wanted to know if it's worthwhile. He knew exactly what it was. He knew the importance. Where's Canada, by the way? Where are you? Where are you? And I appreciate you being here very much, Mr. President. Fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks. So you going back?
I'll go back. I'm glad you upgraded me to president.
Oh, did I say?
At a summit in Egypt, cameras caught a moment that said more than any speech could. As Donald Trump addressed world leaders, he casually referred to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney as the President of Canada. The room went silent for a beat before laughter rippled through the crowd. Carney, calm and composed, smiled and replied that he was glad to be upgraded. It was a light moment on the surface, but underneath it told a deeper story. The United States, once the anchor of global leadership, now looked distracted and defensive. The scene captured how Washington's influence is beginning to slip while others quietly move forward. That exchange wasn't about humor. It reflected how much the global balance has changed. While Trump continues to govern through tariffs and confrontation, his allies are learning to adapt without him. And nowhere is that more visible than in the shifting trade map now surrounding the United States. By mid-October 2025, Washington's tariff spiral had started to rebound on itself. Trump's new 100% duties on Chinese goods triggered a wave of countermeasures far beyond Beijing. China not only expanded its rare earth export limits, but also coordinated quietly with other suppliers, from Indonesia to Kazakhstan, to tighten the flow of battery metals and refined nickel. Within days, global prices for key minerals used in electric vehicles rose nearly 30%, according to the London Metal Exchange. Across the Pacific, U.S. allies began signaling fatigue. Japan and South Korea, both recently pressured to sign investment-heavy trade frameworks with Washington, openly called for predictable and rules-based trade. The European Commission warned that American protectionism was now a systemic risk to global recovery. For manufacturers worldwide, the shock was immediate. German automakers slowed exports to the U.S. Korean chip makers redirected orders toward India, and ASEAN economies expanded intra-Asian trade to insulate themselves from U.S. volatility. Even inside America, frustration grew. The National Retail Federation reported that import costs on consumer goods had jumped 14% since summer, while the Federal Reserve noted continued pressure on inflation despite slower demand. What was intended as a show of strength has become a global rallying point against U.S. tariffs. Instead of bending others to Washington's will, Trump's trade policy is driving them to unite and to trade more with each other. While the U.S. became trapped in multiple trade fights, Canada quietly redrew its own map of alliances. After months of tense talks with Washington that produced no relief on steel, aluminum, or autos, Ottawa moved on to new partnerships. In New Delhi, Canada and India signed a new roadmap for relations in early October 2025. The agreement restarted cooperation on critical minerals, renewable energy, and technology after years of frozen ties. India's Foreign Ministry confirmed the relaunch of the Canada-India Joint Science and Technology Committee and a revived CEO Forum to facilitate cross-border investment. This deal marks the first real thaw since diplomatic tensions in 2023. For Canada, it opens a gateway into South Asia at a time when global manufacturers are shifting supply chains away from China and the U.S. At the same time, Ottawa began to reassess its economic stance with Beijing. Canada should reopen talks with China, especially after Chinese officials offered to lift tariffs on Canadian canola and agricultural goods if Ottawa allowed electric vehicle imports. Those vehicles, priced around 35,000 Canadian dollars, could make Canada's EV market more competitive and lower costs for consumers. Domestically, the Carney government also launched a major industrial program. Industry Minister Melanie Joly's $5 billion plan aims to rebuild manufacturing capacity in clean technology, battery metals, and advanced materials. Ontario, still reeling from U.S. auto tariffs, is leveraging its cheap energy and abundant nickel and cobalt to attract new investment.
These steps signal a turning point. Canada is not waiting for Washington's approval anymore. It is diversifying its trade base, expanding eastward toward Asia and southward toward emerging markets. As one Canadian analyst put it this week, while Washington is building tariff walls, Ottawa is quietly building bridges. Trump's tariff experiment was designed to make America strong again. Instead, it has pushed allies away and strengthened the very competitors Washington wanted to contain. The United States is now surrounded by a network of former partners, Canada, the EU, India, Japan, who are rewriting their trade relationships without American leadership. Each of these economies is deepening cooperation in areas once dominated by the U.S., clean energy, automotive supply chains, and critical minerals. According to the World Trade Organization's latest briefing, global tariff retaliation against U.S. measures now covers over 40% of American exports. The cost is spreading back through U.S. industries, from furniture to heavy machinery. In Michigan and Ohio, where factories rely on Canadian steel, operating margins have fallen by double digits since August. Even Wall Street has taken notice. Analysts at Goldman Sachs estimate that American consumers now shoulder about 55% of all tariff costs through higher prices, a number consistent with patterns seen during the 2018 trade war. Meanwhile, Canada's approach of diversification is beginning to pay off. With new energy and technology partnerships in India and ongoing talks with China, Ottawa has positioned itself as a bridge between Western and Asian markets. Foreign direct investment in Canada rose nearly 9% this quarter, according to Statistics Canada. For the first time in decades, the economic gravity of North America is shifting north of the border. Trump's America First now risks becoming America Alone. The tariffs that were meant to protect domestic industry are driving companies to relocate production and diversify supply chains elsewhere. The symbolism of that moment in Egypt comes full circle. A president mistook a prime minister for another head of state, and the world laughed. But behind the laughter was a recognition that something fundamental had changed. America is no longer the unquestioned center of global trade. Its closest neighbors have learned to compete, and its rivals have learned to cooperate. Trump's tariffs were never just about economics. They were about power. And now that power is turning inward, leaving room for others, Canada included, to lead in ways Washington no longer can.